The last voyage of the Yamato, April 6, 1945. Kia Naval Base, Japan. The great dawn was heavy with silence, broken only by the rhythmic clang of tools and the faint hiss of steam. Along the docks of Kyoto, a colossal shadow loomed. The Yamato, the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy. At 72,000 tons, she was more than a ship. She was a floating fortress, a symbol of the Empire's once mighty ambition. On her deck, sailors moved with a kind of grim reverence. They polished brass fittings and checked the elevation of the massive 18.1-inch guns, the largest ever mounted on a warship, though many knew they would never fire them again. The paint was chipped, the hull scarred from months of inactivity. Fuel was scarce, ammunition was limited, and every man aboard knew that this voyage would likely be their last. Admiral Seiichi Itō stood on the bridge, his uniform pressed, his expression unreadable. The cherry blossoms in Kyoto were in bloom, their petals falling silently into the water, a cruel contrast to the steel behemoth that was about to leave harbor. He looked toward the mountains in the distance, and thought of his wife and son. The radio reports spoke of American fleets closing in on Okinawa. Japan's navy was broken, its air wings shattered, and yet orders had come from Tokyo. The Yamato will sail to Okinawa and fight to the death. The plan was simple and suicidal. The Yamato, escorted by one light cruiser and 8 destroyers, would steam south without air cover, beach itself on Okinawa's western shore, and become a stationary fortress, its guns serving as coastal artillery. Every man aboard was to fight until destroyed. As the morning mist thickened, signal flags fluttered across the mast, engines rumbled to life. Deep within the ship, engineers in oil-stained uniforms fed the boilers. The massive propellers began to churn, sending tremors through the hull. A sailor named Petty Officer Kiyoshi Tanaka stood at the bow, gripping the cold steel railing. He was only 20 years old, his eyes fixed on the horizon. He whispered softly, "For the Emperor," but in his heart he wondered if the Emperor would ever know their name. Admiral Itō adjusted his cap and gave a slow nod to Captain Aruga, the ship's commanding officer. "Signal the fleet," he said. "We sail for Okinawa." The Yamato began to move, a leviathan stirring from its grave. On shore, dockworkers and civilians gathered silently to watch. Some bowed deeply, others turned away. None spoke. They all knew this was not a mission. It was a funeral procession. As the fleet cleared the harbor, the rising sun glinted off the calm inland sea. The warship's massive guns pointed toward the horizon, toward destiny. Above them, the sky was an endless blue, and somewhere beyond that sky, thousands of American planes waited. Below deck, the sound of machinery echoed like a heartbeat. The men of the Yamato, 3,000 souls, prepared for what they knew was the end. Admiral Itō looked once more toward Japan's receding shoreline. The land was fading into mist. He stood rigid, his hand on the railing. In that moment he knew the Empire's greatest ship was leaving its homeland for the last time. Section 2. Into the Storm. April 7, 1945. East China Sea. The morning broke beneath a sky bruised with clouds. The Yamato sliced through the dark waters, her bow cutting a white scar across the gray sea. The waves rolled heavily, flecked with foam, and somewhere beyond the horizon, the American fleet waited, unseen but inevitable. Inside the bridge, the air was thick with the hum of tension. Officers bent over navigation charts, their voices low and steady. Captain Aruga gave quiet orders, while radio operators strained to pick up enemy transmission. The fleet maintained radio silence, their positions marked only by black plumes of smoke drifting across the ocean. At 09:30 hours, lookout posts on the Yamato's superstructure reported distant aircraft contrails to the southeast, faint streaks like scratches across the sky. The word spread quickly. Enemy aircraft sighted. Admiral Itō didn't flinch. He simply nodded and said, "So, they've found us." The Yamato's anti-aircraft crews sprang to action. The 25mm Type 96 cannons swung upward, magazines clattering into place. Men rushed to ammunition hoists, passing belts of shells by hand. Sweat mingled with the stench of oil and salt. Petty Officer Tanaka was now stationed near turret number 2. He could feel the deck trembling beneath him, the slow pulse of the ship's engines carrying through the soles of his boots. His hands shook, though he tried to steady them on the cool metal of the railing. "Tanaka," someone shouted. Aircraft bearing 015. High above, dark specks were moving closer. Hundreds of them, Grumman Helldivers, Curtiss SB-2C, dive bombers, and torpedo-laden Avengers. A storm of American steel. The roar of engines soon filled the air, drowning out all thought. Open fire. The sky erupted. Traces streaked upward, in a furious web of light. Shells bursting into puffs of black smoke. The air filled with the crackle of gunfire and the deep thunder of the main turrets firing in desperation. The Yamato's crew fought with everything they had, their gunnery precise, their resolve unbroken. For a moment it looked as if they might hold. Several planes burst into flames, spiraling down toward the way. Cheers rose from the deck, but were silenced as the first wave of torpedoes struck. A deep, bone-rattling explosion tore through the hull. The ship shuddered violently, the deck heaving underfoot. Water surged in through the starboard side. Alarm klaxons wailed, as engineers scrambled below to seal the flooding compartments. "Damage report," Captain Aruga barked. "Hit starboard, midsection, flooding in boiler room number 3, came the reply. Admiral Itō gripped the edge of the chart table. He could hear the roar of engines, the screaming dive of another bomber overhead. The deck shook again, a bomb detonating near the aft turret. The Yamato was bleeding, but she refused to die. Her anti-aircraft gunners kept firing, smoke and flame engulfing the deck. Men were burned, thrown or crushed, yet others stepped forward to take their place. In the chaos, Tanaka reloaded his weapon, his ears ringing from the constant explosions. Around him, fragments of steel and wood rained down like deadly hail. He glanced skyward, just long enough to see a Helldiver release its payload, the bomb dropping straight toward him. The blast knocked him flat, his vision blurred. The world spun. Through the smoke he could barely see the towering superstructure above him, now wrapped in flame. The Yamato was fighting like a wounded animal, massive, defiant, doomed. Admiral Itō remained calm, even as another report came in. Multiple torpedo hits, port side, flooding uncontrollable. He knew then the end had already begun, but he also knew what must be done. "Signal to all ships," he ordered quietly. "Continue south. The Yamato will draw their fire."
Section 3. The sky turns to fire. April 7th, 1945, 13 hours, south of Kyushu. The sea was no longer blue. It was black, with smoke and oil. The air crackled with gunfire and flame, as wave after wave of American aircraft tore through the Japanese formation. Above the Yamato, the sky burned orange. Dozens of U.S. Navy planes swooped low, their engines howling like banshees. From the carrier Essex, Commander Robert Copeland's strike group had locked onto the massive battleship. Over the radio, his voice was calm, clipped, efficient. Primary target confirmed. Largest battleship ever built. All squadrons. Attack from multiple bearings. Now, at that command, the sky itself seemed to descend. The first formation came in low from the port side. Avengers carrying Mark 13 torpedoes, their silver silhouettes skimmed just above the waves, sunlight flashing across their wings. Anti-aircraft bursts filled the sky around them, but the planes pressed on. On the Yamato's bridge, Admiral Itō watched through binoculars. Port battery. Full fire. The guns roared, and the sea boiled with shell fire. 2 Avengers were shredded mid-air, but 5 more released their torpedoes in perfect sequence. They struck like thunder. The entire ship lurched violently to port, the deck tilting underfoot. Men were thrown from their stations. Compartments below flooded instantly, and the list grew sharper with every passing second. "Counter-flood port side," shouted the damage control officer. Pumps roared, bulkheads groaned, and sailors rushed through waist-deep water to seal ruptured valves. But it was no use. The torpedoes had torn open her belly, and the Yamato was beginning to roll. Above, a second wave of bombers dove from the clouds. The dive angles were so steep that the sun disappeared behind their wings. The bombs screamed as they fell, punching through decks and igniting the secondary magazine. Explosions ripped through the aft section, tearing open the hangar deck where the Yamato's few remaining reconnaissance planes were stored. Flames engulfed the aft turrets. Ammunition cooked off, sending deadly fragments in all directions. Petty Officer Tanaka stumbled through the chaos, his face blackened with soot. Around him, men screamed for water, for medics, for the Kami-sama to save them. The heat was unbearable. The air itself seemed to burn his lungs. He found his station half destroyed, the 25mm gun mount twisted and useless. He turned just in time to see a bomb strike near turret number 1. The explosion throwing bodies and steel high into the air. The sound was not just noise, it was something deeper, a vibration that seemed to shake the bones themselves. Main turret disabled, came a desperate voice over the ship's comms. On the bridge, Captain Aruga clenched his fists. "She's dying," he whispered. Admiral Itō stood silent beside him. His face was pale but steady. Outside the windows, smoke billowed upward like a funeral pyre. "Then she will die as she lived," he said softly, "with honor." By 13:30 the ship was listing nearly 15 degrees. Fires raged across multiple decks. The destroyer Yahzi, one of Yamato's escorts, had already been sunk. Other destroyers were crippled, barely able to maneuver. The sea around them was littered with debris, twisted metal, lifeboats, and the bodies of sailors floating face down in oil-slick water. Still the Yamato fired back. Her remaining guns roared defiantly, sending massive shells skyward, even as her gunners coughed in the smoke and fire. Each shot was like the heartbeat of a dying giant, refusing to fall. Then came the fatal blow. At 14:02, a torpedo struck near the port magazine, the very heart of her ammunition storage. For a moment, there was silence, and then the world split open. A colossal explosion ripped through the ship, a mushroom cloud towering 5 miles into the sky. The Yamato vanished in a single blinding flash. The shockwave flattened the sea, sending a wall of water outward in every direction. Thousands of men were gone in an instant. Only fragments of steel and burning oil remained. From the nearby destroyer Fuyutsuki, survivors watched in stunned silence. Where the Yamato had been, there was now only fire and smoke, and the echo of something vast and tragic ending. Admiral Itō had made his decision before the explosion. Witnesses said he remained on the bridge, refusing evacuation. His final order was simple: let every man die with his post. And then, the pride of Japan, the greatest warship ever built, was no more. Section 4 echoes beneath the waves. April 7th, south of Kyushu. Aftermath. The sea was a graveyard. Black oil floated across the surface, igniting in patches that flickered like dying embers. The wreckage of the Yamato drifted among the waves. Torn steel, shattered lifeboats, and fragments of uniform. The massive explosion had vaporized most of the ship, leaving behind only twisted remnants and a choking cloud of smoke that hung low over the horizon. The Fuyutsuki and Yukikaze, the few surviving destroyers, moved cautiously through the wreckage. Their decks were lined with stunned sailors staring into the dark water. They called out for survivors, but only the wind answered, carrying faint cries quickly swallowed by the sea. Petty Officer Kiyoshi Tanaka had somehow survived the blast. He floated among the debris, clinging to a piece of charred wood. His body was burned, his face covered in oil and blood. Every breath was agony. Around him drifted the bodies of his comrades, men who had joked with him just hours earlier, now lifeless and silent. He turned his head weakly toward the rising column of smoke. The Yamato was gone. The ship that had once symbolized the invincibility of Japan was now scattered across the sea. He whispered hoarsely, "We were supposed to reach Okinawa." Then his eyes closed, and the current carried him away. Aboard the Fuyutsuki, a lookout shouted, "Survivor spotted off the port bow." Sailors threw ropes and life rings, pulling a handful of men from the wreckage. Of the more than 3,000 who had sailed aboard the Yamato, fewer than 300 would live. Admiral Itō was not among them. He had chosen to remain on the bridge, his cap still in place, his hands folded behind his back as the flames closed in. Captain Aruga, too, went down with his ship, reportedly saluting as the final explosion came. The Americans had achieved what their carriers were built for, the destruction of the last threat from Japan's navy. Aboard the U.S. carriers Essex, Intrepid and Bunker Hill, pilots returned to their decks, silent and somber. Despite the victory, they knew what they had just witnessed was not merely a battle. It was the death of an era. One pilot, Lieutenant Commander Jack Davis, wrote in his after-action log, "No cheering, no triumph, only awe." By evening, the sea had grown calm again. Smoke lingered on the horizon, marking the grave of the Yamato. The sun set in a dull crimson haze, the color of blood in water. Back in Tokyo, news of the loss reached Naval headquarters late that night. Silence filled the room. As the message was read aloud, no one spoke. The officers simply bowed their heads. Admiral Seiichi Itō, chief of the combined fleet, broke the silence with a single line. But in his heart he knew, the Imperial Japanese Navy had ceased to exist. The next morning, in Hiroshima Bay, fishermen found pieces of steel washed ashore, fragments of the great ship. Children gathered them, unaware of what they were holding. To them, they were just bits of metal. To the nation, they were relics of a dream now sunk beneath the sea. The war was not yet over, but for Japan, the Yamato's destruction marked a final, irreversible turning point. No more mighty fleets would sail, no more grand offensives would be launched. What remained was only desperation, and the long inevitable descent towards surrender. As dawn broke over the East China Sea, the waves closed over the last remnants of the Yamato. The sea, indifferent and endless, kept her secret.
Section 5. The Admiral's Last Vision, April 7th, 1945. Moments before the end, before the explosion consumed her, deep inside the bridge of the Yamato, Admiral Seiichi Itō stood silently beside Captain Aruga. The world outside was chaos, fires raging across the decks, shells cooking off, the roar of incoming aircraft. But inside that steel chamber, time seemed to slow. Smoke seeped through the broken windows. The air stank of burning paint, cordite, and blood. Crewmen stumbled in with reports, faces blackened and uniforms torn. "Admiral, we've lost engine control, flooding in compartments 8 through 11. The ship can't be saved." Itō gave a faint nod. His face was calm, almost serene. "I see," he said quietly. "Then we have done all we can." He looked to Captain Aruga, whose right arm hung limp and bloodied. The captain's voice cracked as he asked, "Permission to dismiss the crew, sir?" The Admiral turned to face him, eyes steady. "No," he said firmly. "They have fulfilled their duty. There is nowhere left to go." A long silence followed. Only the distant pounding of water against the hull filled the space. Admiral Itō reached into his uniform pocket and drew out a small envelope. Inside was a letter, written to his wife days before departure. The ink had smudged slightly from the damp sea air, but the handwriting was firm. "When you read this, I will be gone. Do not grieve. I sail knowing that the sea will take me as it has taken all sailors before. Japan has given all it can. What remains is to face the end with dignity." He folded the letter carefully and tucked it inside his tunic once more. Then, turning toward the open bridge windows, he looked out over the burning deck. The sun was half hidden by smoke, the sea below aflame with leaking fuel. Men ran, fell and rose again, fighting fires, helping the wounded, refusing to abandon their posts. "It is beautiful," he murmured. "Even in death she fights." Captain Aruga saluted. She was the greatest ship ever built. Itō smiled faintly. And the last of her kind. Another explosion shook the bridge closer this time, the glass shattering inward. Fragments cut across the floor. Aruga stumbled, catching himself on the railing. The deck tilted sharply to port. The Yamato was dying fast. The admiral steadied himself and gave his final order. All hands, stand by your stations. No order for abandonment. No plea for surrender. Just the command to remain, as the Imperial Navy tradition demanded. Outside, sailors in the gun turrets saluted as the bridge burned. Some shouted, "Banzai," not as a cry of defiance, but as a farewell. Others prayed quietly, clutching amulets or photographs of loved ones. Then came the final blow, the torpedo that would ignite the magazine. Itō felt it before he heard it. A deep vibration that ran through the steel like a heartbeat ending. He looked toward the horizon one last time, the direction of Okinawa, and whispered, "May this sacrifice mean something." A blinding white light filled the bridge. Witnesses on nearby destroyers later said they saw the Yamato rise out of the sea, her bow lifted by the force of the explosion. A single plume of fire shot skyward, splitting the heavens. In that instant, Admiral Itō, Captain Aruga, and nearly all aboard were gone, but those who saw it would never forget. The image of Japan's mightiest battleship, disappearing beneath the waves, carrying with her the pride and tragedy of an empire at war. Section 6. The Death of an Empire. April 8, 1945, Tokyo Imperial Naval Headquarters. The morning sky over Tokyo was gray with drizzle. Inside the underground command bunker, the air was still and cold. The officers of the Imperial Japanese Navy sat in silence as the final coded transmission from the Yamato was decrypted and read aloud. Enemy aircraft attacking in wave. Damage severe. Flooding uncontrollable. Will proceed as ordered. Long live the Emperor. Then nothing. Static. Admiral Seiichi Itō, chief of the combined fleet, removed his glasses and stared at the table. Around him senior staff officers stood motionless, their faces ashen. The words they had just heard were not simply a report. They were an obituary. The Yamato, the greatest battleship ever built, the very symbol of Japan's maritime power, was gone. No one spoke for several minutes. The only sound was the slow drip of condensation from the ceiling. Finally, Toyoda stood and said quietly, "The Yamato has fought to the end." A younger officer clenched his fists. "Admiral, should we send a message of commendation to her crew?" Toyoda shook his head. "There is no one left to receive it." The men bowed their head. The silence that followed felt heavier than any explosion. For the officers who had devoted their lives to the Imperial Navy, the sinking of the Yamato was not just a military defeat. It was the death of a philosophy, the end of everything they believed in. Since the days of Admiral Taiyogo and the victory at Tsushima, Japan's strength had rested on the sea. But now there was no sea power left to command. The great carriers were gone. The cruisers lay rusting in harbor. The destroyers were running on fuel. And now the last battleship, the soul of their fleet, slept beneath the East China Sea. Outside, the city was quiet. Tokyo's streets were lined with sandbags and bomb shelters, its people weary from nightly air raids. Few knew yet what had happened to the Yamato. The government would not announce it. There was no point. The truth was too heavy to bear. In a small apartment in Hiroshima, a telegram arrived for Mrs. Itō, the admiral's wife. She opened it slowly, hands trembling. The message was brief, formal, and merciless. "Your husband has fallen in battle. The combined fleet extends its deepest condolences." She placed the paper down, folded her hands and stared out the window. Cherry blossoms were drifting past, carried by the spring wind. They reminded her of the day her husband had departed, when he had smiled and said, "The sea will take care of me." She whispered, "Seiichi, you've kept your promise." Across Japan, the few surviving Yamato crewmen who had been rescued returned home weeks later, pale and hollow-eyed. Many could not speak of what they had seen. Others simply stared at the horizon, haunted by the image of their ship, her deck burning, her guns silent, her flag still flying until the end. In taverns and train stations, rumors spread that the Yamato had gone down fighting, that her explosion could be seen for miles, that her spirit still sailed beneath the waves. For some it was a story of pride, for others it was a sign that the gods had turned away. To the Americans, the sinking was a tactical victory, but to the Japanese it was something far greater. It was the moment they understood that the war could not be won. Admiral Toyoda, writing in his personal diary that night, put it simply, "Now our heart is gone." And as the rain continued to fall over Tokyo, a sense of quiet resignation spread through the corridors of power. The empire had reached its twilight. The drums of victory had fallen silent. All that remained was a long, inevitable descent into surrender, and the haunting echo of the sea, where the Yamato slept in eternal silence.
Section 7. Beneath the Rising Sun, April 10th, 1945, East China Sea. The sea had calmed, where days earlier smoke and thunder had torn the heavens. Now only waves rolled gently. The coordinates of the Yamato's resting place were already marked on American naval charts. Yet to the sailors who passed through the area, it was more than a location. It was hallowed ground. Beneath nearly 1,000 feet of cold water lay the shattered hull of the world's largest battleship. The stern had broken away. The main turrets, each the size of a small building, were buried in the silt. The once mighty bridge, where Admiral Itō had stood, was now a twisted ruin. Fish drifted through open corridors, and the sea had claimed the decks with a strange, almost reverent stillness. In the darkness below, silence reigned. No engines, no footsteps, no voices, only the quiet pulse of the ocean, like a heartbeat slowed to nothing. The Yamato had become a tomb for over 3,000 men. Above the wreck, the destroyer Yukikaze, one of the few to survive the battle, returned days later on a search mission. Her crew lined the railings. Heads bowed, they tossed wreaths of flowers into the sea, white chrysanthemums that floated briefly before sinking into the waves. Lieutenant Nakamura, one of Yukikaze's officers, murmured, "She sleeps now, the pride of the empire sleeps." No one responded. The men simply stood in silence, watching the last petals vanish beneath the water. Far away, in the United States, photographs of the Yamato's sinking appeared in newspapers. Headlines celebrated the destruction of Japan's greatest warship. To the American public, it was proof that victory was near, but to a few of the pilots who had been part of the strike, the feeling was more complicated. Lieutenant Jack Davis, who had witnessed the final explosion, wrote in a letter home, "We didn't just sink a ship, we sank an idea, the belief that power could come from armor and guns alone." Watching her go down, I felt no triumph, only the weight of history ending. For Japan, that truth would arrive slowly, painfully. The loss of the Yamato was more than a military disaster. It was the symbolic collapse of everything the nation had built its pride upon. When the emperor was informed, he reportedly sat in silence for several minutes, his expression unreadable. Then, he said quietly, "So, the Yamato has gone to her ancestors. In Shinto tradition, get spirits dwell within nature, in the mountains, the wind, the sea." To many Japanese, the Yamato's spirit now lived in the waters of the East China Sea, guarding the souls of her crew. Fishermen who sailed near the area claimed they sometimes saw strange lights beneath the surface at night, flickers of blue, like lanterns moving slowly in the depths. They said it was the Yamato's crew, still standing their posts. By summer, the tide of war had turned completely. Okinawa fell, Tokyo burned under relentless bombing, and yet, in the midst of ruin, the story of the Yamato spread, not as propaganda, but as legend. Children whispered it in classrooms. The Yamato fought against 1,000 planes, and did not surrender, old veterans said. She carried the spirit of Japan. Even those who had lost faith found themselves repeating her name in mourning, not for victory, but for what was lost in the quiet corners of shrines and temples. Prayers were offered for the souls of the fallen sailors. Bells rang softly in the morning mist, echoing across the harbors, where once the Imperial fleet had assembled in pride. The Yamato, now silent beneath the waves, had become more than a ship. She was memory, she was the last breath of a nation that had believed itself invincible, and now understood the price of that belief. Section 8. The Fall of the Rising Sun. August 15, 1945. Tokyo, Japan. 4 months had passed since the Yamato sank beneath the waves. Japan was no longer the same nation that had sent her to sea. The cities lay in ruins, burned to ash by American firebombs. The Imperial Navy was gone, its proud ships rusting in shattered harbors, or lying silent beneath the ocean floor. The once mighty rising sun flag now fluttered weakly above an empire reduced to dust. In the Imperial Palace, the air was heavy with heat and dread. Cicadas droned in the summer air outside, indifferent to the moment unfolding inside the marble walls. At precisely noon, Emperor Hirohito's voice came over the radio, soft, distant, trembling with both sorrow and finality. To our good and loyal subjects, the war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage. We have decided to effect a settlement of the present situation. Across the nation, millions stopped what they were doing. In fields, in factories, in bombed-out streets, people listened, kneeling on the ground. Some wept quietly, others stared into nothing. It was the first time the Japanese people had ever heard the voice of their emperor, and in that voice, they heard what none had dared to say aloud. Japan had surrendered. In that moment, the Yamato's final voyage took on new meaning. It had not been a mission to win. It had been an offering, a final sacrifice to a dying dream. Admiral Ito's decision to go down with his ship now seemed less like despair and more like prophecy. He had known, even as he gave his last order, that the war was already lost. In a small fishing village on Kyushu's southern coast, a group of children played near the shore. One of them pointed to the horizon, where the sea shimmered under the afternoon sun. "That's where the Yamato sleeps," an old fisherman said softly, his voice cracked from salt and age. "She guards Japan now." From below, the boy frowned. "But she lost, didn't she?" The old man looked out across the water, his gaze distant. "No ship that fights for her people ever truly loses," he said. "But the men who send her to die, they lose something great." Meanwhile, in American-occupied Okinawa, young naval officers studied photographs of the Yamato's wreckage. Fascinated by her colossal scale, the U.S. Navy engineers marveled that a ship so powerful could be destroyed by aircraft alone. To them, it was proof of the future, that air power had rendered battleships obsolete. The age of steel giants was over. The age of the sky had begun. But for Japan, it was not strategy or technology that mattered anymore. It was memory. Survivors of the Yamato, now scattered across a broken country, gathered in quiet ceremonies. They bowed before small shrines, their faces shadowed with guilt and pride. One survivor, Seaman First Class Hiroshi Takamura, spoke to a reporter decades later. "When the ship went down, I thought I had lost everything. My comrades, my purpose, my nation. But in time, I realized what sank that day was not just a ship. It was our belief that dying was more honorable than living."
The sound of the Emperor's broadcast lingered in the air for hours after it ended. People wandered the streets in silence, unsure of what to do, unsure even of how to feel. Japan's long war, the war that had begun with triumphs across Asia and oceans, had ended not in glory, but in ashes, and beneath the waves of the East China Sea, the Yamato lay undisturbed, her flag still etched faintly into rusting metal, her great guns pointing eternally toward Okinawa. The deep had become her home, her monument, her confession. The spirit of the Yamato would not rise again, but her story of courage, of blindness, of sacrifice would live on in the hearts of those who survived. For in the end, the Yamato was not merely a ship that went to war. She was the soul of a nation, learning, through fire and ruin, what it meant to be human again.
Section 9, Legacy of the Yamato. April 7, 1980, Kagoshima Prefecture, Japan. 35 years after the Yamato's final battle, the sea was calm again. A memorial ceremony was underway at the Kure Naval Base, the birthplace of the ship that had once been the largest battleship ever built. Veterans, their backs bent with age, stood in silence as incense smoke drifted through the air, mixing with the salty wind. Photographs of Admiral Seiichi Itō, Captain Kosaku Aruga, and the hundreds of sailors who perished were displayed beneath the rising sun flag. Beside them stood families, wives who had waited decades, sons who had never met their fathers, and grandchildren learning the weight of a name carved into a memorial stone. A former Yamato officer, now gray-haired and frail, stepped up to the microphone. His voice trembled as he began. "We believed we were unsinkable. We believed in our emperor, our ship, our destiny. But the sea teaches you humility. It reminds you that no power, not even the greatest, lasts forever." As he spoke, the waves lapped gently at the harbor walls, the same waters that had once carried the Yamato out to her death. In museums across Japan, children stared up at massive-scale models of the battleship, gleaming replicas of her once mighty frame. Guides told them of her size, 72,000 tons, 9 18-inch guns, a crew of 3,000 men. The statistics amazed them, but what stayed in their minds were the faces, the stories of men who knew they would die, yet sailed anyway. For historians, the Yamato symbolized the end of an era, the twilight of battleships, and the dawn of air dominance. The American victory in Operation Tengo had proven once and for all that industrial power and technology would decide wars of the modern age. But for the Japanese, the Yamato carried deeper meaning, both pride and tragedy. She had been built not just of steel, but of hope. She was meant to embody the spirit of Japan, indomitable, disciplined, eternal. Her destruction was not simply a military defeat. It was a spiritual collapse, a reckoning with the cost of blind loyalty and unyielding pride. Yet even in defeat, the Yamato's legend endured. Her name became a symbol, not of war, but of remembrance. Poets wrote of her as the steel chrysanthemum, blooming once before fading into the deep. Artists painted her last voyage beneath dark skies, surrounded by flame and rain. Filmmakers resurrected her story on screen, showing the humanity of the men aboard, their laughter, their fear, their unspoken acceptance of fate. In one famous scene from a later documentary, a survivor stood before the ocean, the wind tugging at his uniform. He bowed deeply, whispering into the sea, "Admiral Itō, Captain Aruga, we came home. I wish you could have." The camera lingered on the horizon, the waves stretching endlessly. Beneath that calm surface lay the rusted bones of the Yamato. Her turrets collapsed, her hull split open by time. Nature had claimed her, yet she remained untouched in spirit, a cathedral of steel in the deep. And though Japan rebuilt, its cities glowing with neon light, its industry reborn, the memory of the Yamato never faded. She became both a warning and a prayer, a warning of what happens when pride blinds judgment,
and a prayer for peace everlasting. Today, divers still visit the wreck site, 200 kilometers southwest of Kyushu. They bring offerings, flowers, flags, coins, and folded paper cranes, letting them drift down into the dark. The sea accepts them all without a sound. Beneath those waves, where sunlight fades into silence, the Yamato sleeps, not as a weapon, nor as a monument of war, but as a reminder of a time when nations built gods out of iron, and men followed them to the end. Her story endures, not because she was the strongest, but because she was the last of her kind, the final song of the battleship era. And as long as the waves break against Japan's shores, the name Yamato will echo, a word of pride, of sorrow, and of remembrance. The sea keeps her secrets, but some legends never sink.